بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
ما عرفناه عربي انجليزي.
To this Brookings Doha Center policy discussion, which tonight will focus on a very important issue that's increasingly becoming important not just for us in the region but internationally, and that is the developments in Syria. My name is Sultan Barakat, and I'm the Director of Research at the Doha Institute, Doha Brookings Center. And I have the pleasure to have with us an extremely knowledgeable panel of discussants who would help us unpack what is becoming increasingly a very, very difficult and complex issue. Before we start, I'd like to ask you please to switch off your phones, if I may, and to remind you that this session, and to remind our speakers that this session is going to be recorded and will be broadcasted on Al Jazeera Mubashir at some stage, and I suspect without much editing. So the subject can be emotive, as you can imagine, and we just need to be careful with the words we use occasionally. The Syria crisis has been going on for over 4.5 years now, approaching its fifth year. Almost more than that now.
Almost
Fifth 5 years now, and has resulted in a major humanitarian catastrophe in the region. The number of people killed, depending on what statistics you read, ranges from 150,000 to over 350,000 people, including some 30,000 children. Roughly half of the population is now displaced inside and outside Syria. And increasingly and very quickly, the whole situation is unraveling into a regional crisis and has drawn recently some international intervention. And for tonight, we will particularly focus on the recent developments, including the Russian intervention in Syria, and try and weigh the good and the not so good and the ugly side of the Russian intervention in the conflict. But we'll also talk about the refugee crisis and its effect, particularly on neighboring countries, and the increasing effect on Europe, which has drawn Europe again into the discussion over Syria. We will also be covering the Islamic State and try and understand why is it with so many members of the alliance, and the alliance seems to be growing on a daily basis. The Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State, continues to exert power on the ground. But to start with, we will focus on the issue of the current conference in Riyadh, which to me represents an opportunity, and we'd like to understand from our colleagues here in what way it is different from previous attempts to try and bring the Syrians together. To help us make sense of all of this, we have an extremely distinguished panelist for tonight. To start with, Dr. Marwan Qabalan, whom we're extremely grateful for him to have made himself available on a relatively short notice. As you know, in the original announcement, we had Sheikh Mu'adh al-Khatib, but he couldn't be with us, unfortunately, tonight because he had to join the meeting, the coordination meeting taking place in Riyadh tonight and tomorrow. But Dr. Marwan is very well known to those of us in Doha and to those who also watch Al Jazeera. He's often hosted by Al Jazeera as one of the foremost analysts in the region. He is the head of the policy analysis group at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He holds a PhD in international relations, and until November 2012, he was the dean of the Faculty of International Relations and Diplomacy at the Qalamon University in Damascus. He was also a member of the board of directors of the Damascus University's Center for Strategic Studies and Research, and Dr. Marwan has authored many books and academic articles, too many to name, both on Syria and on the politics of the Middle East in general. So we're looking forward to hearing Dr. Marwan's view on what's going on, very much as an analyst, but also as a Syrian who's concerned and who's been following very closely what's going on. Our second speaker is Noah Bonze. Noah is the senior analyst of the International Crisis Group, who's focused on Syria, and he has been member of the International Crisis Group since April 2013. And as you will be aware, the International Crisis Group, I think, presents quite frequently some of the most balanced and in-depth analysis of situations across the globe, and in particular on Syria. The writings have been very important for all of us. In his previous life as an Arabic social media analyst, Noah worked for a private consulting firm, and he holds a BA from Williams College and a master's in Arabic from Maryland University. Thank you so much for joining us, and I know you had a rough journey coming here that took you more than was planned for, so we're very grateful you could join us. And our third panelist is our very own Charles Lister. Charles does not need introduction, I think, to those of us in Doha. He's been a visiting fellow with the Brookings Doha Center for almost 2 years now, focused almost entirely on understanding terrorism, insurgency, and in particular, how jihadist movements operate within Syria. He also produced one of our best read analysis paper on ISIS entitled Profiling ISIS. And very soon, we're going to release another paper by Charles comparing between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and understanding their linkages and the way they've diverted from each other. But more recently, he produced this amazing book, The Syrian Jihad, and it talks in detail about the rise of Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and the overall evolution of insurgency in Syria, which we highly recommend for you to read. And those of you who are interested, there is a flyer from the publishers, Hearst, just outside the room. If you fill it in and you order the book through this flyer, I understand you get an additional discount, or a discount. Actually reasonably priced for a newly released book. Well, with that, the format for today is we're trying to conclude around 10 minutes past 7, and I'm very keen to allow at least half an hour for the audience to ask questions and to participate, to be part of this debate. And therefore, I've asked our speakers not to start by a position speech of 10 to 15 minutes as we usually do, but to respond directly to questions, and we'll try and keep it as dynamic as the conflict is in Syria today. So I'll kickstart the discussion by really focusing our minds on the meeting that is taking place in Riyadh as we speak. Today is a preparation meeting, and hopefully they start the work tomorrow. It's there for about 2 days. And my starting question really to Marwan, if I may, what is qualitatively different about this meeting compared to previous meetings where the international community tried to bring the Syrian opposition together?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak before this very distinguished audience. Well, I think there are a few reasons that makes this meeting different, actually, from previous meetings. The first one is that this one has been actually requested and agreed upon by the great and regional powers who met in Vienna, in the last Vienna meeting, in fact, on November 14, when they agreed on the so-called roadmap to a political solution in Syria. So today we have the blessing of the Russians, the Americans, the Turks, the other players in this conflict, and except for Iran, actually, which is not very much actually in favor of this meeting, fearing that the Saudis will be actually trying to form a delegation that is not going to take, I mean, the Iranian position, which is very much feels like those who are in Riyadh, some of them are terrorist organizations, according to the Iranian position. So this is number one. So we have now this sort of international and regional agreement on that. Riyadh should actually hold this meeting, bring all the Syrian opposition groups, both the political opposition and the armed groups on the ground, to come and meet in Riyadh and try actually to reach an agreement that we might talk about later. The second thing actually which makes this meeting different is that maybe for the first time we are bringing most of the heavyweight within the Syrian opposition. I'm talking here about the armed groups, yeah? So today we are having not only the political factions that we used to have, like Al-I'tilaf or like Hayat Tansiq or others, but we are having the major armed groups like Jaish al-Islam, of course we don't have all of them, but we have the most important factions, armed factions, Syrian factions. So bringing all these people together, I think that makes it also different from previous meetings. So we have on one hand this international agreement on having the Syrian opposition coming together, and we have most of the key players within actually the opposition scene coming together and meeting in Riyadh. And we hope that they can agree on two things. Number one is agree on the broad lines of the political solution or the political settlement in Syria, because some of them actually they don't agree on how the transitional period is going to look like in Syria. They don't agree, for example, on the future of Bashar al-Assad. They don't agree, for example, on whether Bashar al-Assad should leave at the very beginning or in the middle or at the very end. So there are few details, but very important details, in my opinion, that they should actually work out something in order to agree on them. Number two is they must agree on forming one delegation for the opposition. And that is another challenging issue, in my opinion, for them. Because as some of these factions, mainly the political factions, they don't agree on certain things. So there is always the fear that when you form a delegation in order to start a negotiation process with the regime, so here actually you might be having problems by having different opinions within the same delegation. And that is something that they should also work out something in order to overcome it. So these are the things that, in my opinion, are very important and makes this Riyadh meeting a bit different from previous attempts in order to bring together the Syrian opposition. And let's hope that this would work tomorrow.
Right. Thank you very much. And Charles, the fact that the armed groups are participating in this meeting is significant. Could you just give us an idea of what armed groups were left out and what armed groups are included in this rough idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I won't go into too much specific details. Not all of it is public yet, but I suppose the most significant point to take in mind is that, as Marwan has pointed to, invitations were sent out to probably the two largest and most powerful armed groups in Syria, namely Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Sham. And both of those organizations, for varying reasons, have proven questionable, especially to the Western world, in terms of allowing them a place within a political process. But I think one of the most interesting changes that's taken place over the last roughly 6 to 12 months has been there has been an increasing recognition in the West. First with regards to Jaish al-Islam, and more recently with regards to Ahrar Sham, that both of these organizations are sufficiently Syrian, forgetting their ideological conservatism. They are Syrian, inherently national with regards to their objectives, and they're simply too heavy and too powerful on the ground to take out or to ignore. And so their involvement signals probably more of an important change with regards to Western political policy on Syria than it does necessarily with the region, who I think have always insisted that these kind of groups should play a role in a political process when it does start. And I think a large reason for why that change has taken place in the West is because the Vienna process is qualitatively more serious than anything probably we've seen so far, certainly since the early stages of the conflict. And to have those groups not involved would essentially be signaling that the political process isn't serious. One of the biggest objectives thus far out of Riyadh, partially out of Riyadh, is that there will be pressure placed on the armed opposition as a whole to agree to the idea of a nationwide ceasefire, which will begin or be initiated around about the same time that negotiations start. Now, if we're talking about a nationwide ceasefire, you need nationwide participation of the armed opposition, and you especially need the most powerful Syrian groups on the ground, which is why we've seen those two organizations invited. More broadly, there's probably 5 or 6 Southern Front participants who have been invited to Riyadh. There are probably 4 or so what would broadly be termed Northern Free Syrian Army factions, and then a couple sort of mainstream Islamists. In total, there are 14 to 15 armed opposition participants who have arrived in Riyadh last night, a few of them the day before that. Now, the problem is, whilst we've highlighted that it's important that the armed opposition have been invited to be part of this opposition conference, at least in my personal opinion, their weight, the ratio of armed opposition compared to other participants is just simply far too low. And from what I'm aware, a great deal of the major power players from both the region and further afield in the West had initially intended and wanted a far more significant proportion of this opposition delegation to include armed groups. Probably, the initial numbers for the whole opposition conference were around 65 people that were going to be invited. It's now gone up to 102. But within that 65, the initial idea was to have at least 20 from the 15 to 20 from the armed opposition, which is a fairly significant proportion. Now we have 14 out of 102. So that weighting has significantly reduced. And I think that, paired with the fact that what the armed opposition call the Assad's acceptable opposition, many of whom are still based in Syria, they're equally rated with the armed opposition. And I know from personal experience, I'm sure that's going to cause significant problems in Riyadh with regards to the level of respect both of those sides pay to each other. So it's important that they're there, but in my personal opinion, there should be many more.
Right, and those groups in general, the rest of the world kind of labeled now as reasonably moderate, and they can talk to. And I know you don't like the label moderate and extremist, but these are the people that we can do business with. Now, by them actually going to the meeting, they are also signaling their willingness to have a political settlement as opposed to win the war on the ground. And the question is to Noah, really, what is it that changed in their position? Because a few months ago, a year ago, they would not accept to go to negotiate in public as they are doing now. What is it that changed in their position on the ground? And had Russia anything to do with that change, or is it just a coincidence?
I think among the major armed groups, and in particular the Islamists, and if we focused on the biggest ones, Jaysh al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham, and here I'm referring to what I would call Fasad al-Thawriya as opposed to Salafi jihadis. And I think it's an important distinction. Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as ISIS, of course, have adhere to a Salafi jihadi ideology of trans-border war to sort of overthrow the nation-state system in the Muslim world. If we talk about Fasad al-Thawriya Islamiyya, Ahrar al-Sham and Jaysh al-Islam, Islamist revolutionary groups, there are some key strategic, ideological, and political differences separating an Ahrar al-Sham, for instance, and Jabhat al-Nusra. And we've seen, I would say gradually over the last 2 years, some of those key ideological and political differences have come more to the fore, have become more prominent in public discourse as well as in decision-making. And that part of that is a gradual evolution of Ahrar al-Sham in particular towards more political engagement, investing more time and resources of their own, and becoming increasingly willing to debate publicly with Jabhat al-Nusra and with Salafi jihadis more broadly the merits of this strategy. And just to mention some of these key ideological and political differences, because I think they're important. It's not just, in Ahrar al-Sham is not, or other groups more moderate than it. For one, they're focused within Syria. They are not subscribing to a transnational violent jihad. Also, there's the question of pluralism, political pluralism. Ahrar al-Sham, as well as other revolutionary Islamist groups, have publicly committed and have been increasingly forthcoming in acknowledging the right of Syrian people to choose their form of governance and who would represent them, acknowledging that there would need to be political pluralism among parties and currents, as well as a religious pluralism that, while Islamist revolutionary groups have become increasingly clear on the need to protect the role of minorities within Syrian society and their presence there, Salafi jihadis, to include Jabhat al-Nusra, have been quite clear in rejecting those kinds of guarantees. And the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra went on Al Jazeera and talked about, well, we'll protect the Alawis basically if they convert to Islam, as he put it. So these are key differences. There's some others too. Whereas Salafi jihadis, including Jabhat al-Nusra, or at least its more hardline leadership, view regional states backing the Syrian opposition ultimately as enemies, as apostate governments. Even Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia they view as apostate governments who are ultimately a target on their long-term war. Ahrar al-Sham, other Islamist revolutionary groups view these as allies. So these are key differences and I think ultimately irreconcilable. What we've seen is very gradually the Islamist revolutionary groups have been more willing to talk about that, to engage more politically, and projects such as that in which Brookings have been involved have I think been quite helpful in moving that along. With regard to the Russian intervention, I think that the Russian intervention was key in raising the level of alarm among the various external actors in Syria on the need to resume or recreate a political process of some kind. I'm not sure that it was instrumental in the decision-making of the armed groups themselves, though it may have helped nudge. What is lacking, though, I think, while I agree with what Marwan said with regard to some of the positives that are coming out of Vienna and could come out of Riyadh, one negative that I think remains, at the basis of Geneva 1 and 2 was the premise of a Russian-American consensus that is actually quite narrow. Right? The Russians and Americans don't agree on whether a political process should end Assad rule, as the Americans hold, or sustain it, as ultimately the Russians, I think, still believe, and certainly the Iranians believe. And those positions that disagreement between the US and Russia hasn't really gotten any closer, at least not in any way that we can tell. And so the fact that you still have, that's a very big hole at the center of what matters most politically in Syria, and it's going to be very difficult to build a viable political process around that hole.
But do you agree with those who say that the situation has now reached a point where it's mutually hurting for both the government and the armed opposition, and this is one of the reasons why they're willing to take part in such talks?
I think it's...
Or are they still stronger on the ground than we think?
I think that one thing we found in this conflict is the almost endless capacity for actors on both sides to look ahead 3, 6 months, a year in the future and optimistically imagine how their position might be stronger or better. Yeah. And this has helped discourage compromise on both sides. And sometimes one side does it more than the other. I think ultimately, though, it's not going to be the Syrian players themselves, unfortunately, who are going to be able to provide the momentum for getting a political process rolling. It really does need to come from the regional and international backers on both sides. And as I mentioned, as I alluded to earlier, I don't quite think we're there yet. It's become a regional proxy war of attrition, as we were discussing earlier. And if we're talking about what the price that the Iranians and Russians are willing to pay on one side, the price that the Qatars, the Saudis, the Turks, to some extent the Americans are willing to pay on the other, I don't think we've yet gotten to a point where that is a mutually hurting stalemate. Certainly, the Iranians and Russians are still escalating quite significantly.
Right.
I think if I may add something to what Noah has just said, I think today, except for the Islamic State, Daesh, and Bashar al-Assad, everybody seems to me convinced that there's going to be no military solution to this conflict. Even the Russians, when they decided to intervene in Syria, merely 3 weeks later, they decided to start this Vienna process, in the sense that indeed they intervened in Syria in order to halt the rapid deterioration of the military position of the regime on one hand, to weaken the opposition, to stop the opposition, to halt the advance of the opposition, especially in the north and northwest of the country. But on the other hand, they immediately started this political track alongside their military intervention in the country. So to me, I believe that everybody except, as I said, because Bashar al-Assad is saying we can't actually start any political process unless we deal with the terrorism issue first, which means actually because he knows, I mean, there is going to be a price that he must pay if any political solution starts according to, I mean, to Vienna. So almost all the parties, the Syrians, the regional, and the international actors, they think that there is going to be no military solution to this, and that was very clear to everybody. When the Russians intervened, actually, we all saw what the Tau missiles did in Hama and in Idlib. So when the Russians decided to push hard in favor of the regime, because this is a war by proxy, and everybody understands that very well today, nobody is going to allow the other side to win this conflict. Nobody is going to allow his own allies actually to lose this conflict. So this war will carry on for as long as it takes for these regional and international players. Don't forget that the biggest price is paid by Syrians. And to me, it is true that everybody is willing to fight until the last drop of Syrian blood. But on the other hand, there is a point where everybody will come to the conclusion that maybe it's time to start to talk about a political solution, because there is no way that any party will be able to win this conflict. And I think maybe the international community has come close enough actually to reach this conclusion. This is why they started this Vienna process, in which we are hopeful that it will end up with actually some sort of a political solution, I mean, to this conflict, which, I mean, destroyed an entire nation.
Right. I mean, there's no doubt that the Russian intervention has given a new lease of life to Assad. You know,
Absolutely.
They've come at a critical moment,
Absolutely.
and they've given him a huge boost.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is it?
There is no question that anybody actually can bring him down militarily. I mean, the Russians, they stopped that. I mean,
that's not possible now.
That is not possible anymore,
Right.
Because that is something that Russia has made clear now, given its involvement in Syria. But now it's time.
But what would it take to sustain the Russian interest in Syria? And to answer that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit of why Russia got so strongly on the side of Assad, and Assad in particular.
Well, I think there are many reasons. Some of them has nothing to do with Syria, in my opinion. The Russian intervention in Syria is not merely made possible because of Syria.
Not for the sake of Syria.
It's not for the sake of Syria, and it's not only because the Russians has so much interest invested in this country. I think there are other reasons that has nothing to do with Syria. One of them actually has to do with Putin himself and his attempt to make his image as, at least to the Russian public opinion, that he's a strong leader, that he can actually make his country or bring his country back to where it was during the Cold War as a strong, great power. Ukraine, in my opinion, was a very important issue here in the Syrian crisis. And I think Putin was trying actually to retaliate somehow to the slap on the face, in my opinion, that the West gave him because he lost Ukraine. And I think Ukraine is much more important to Putin than Syria if we make this comparison between Ukraine and Syria. There is no comparison given the importance of Ukraine for Putin, his project, the Eurasian Union, is entirely dependent on Ukraine being under Russian influence.
Yeah.
He did actually manage to bring Ukraine under Russian influence in the election of 2010, but he lost Ukraine in 2014. And because he couldn't actually maintain the whole country, the whole of Ukraine under his control, he decided to take part of it because he lost it to the West. I think in Syria, he was actually retaliating in some way, I mean, to the Ukrainian crisis. On the other hand, he thought of himself that Russia is a great power. Nobody can impose sanctions on a great power. Nobody can deal with a great power in such a humiliating way. So I think it has to, I mean, there are of course other reasons. He saw that the Americans are not really interested. They don't have real interest in this country. So he can actually use Syria in order to rebuild his image as a strong leader on the cheap without paying a heavy price, because in Ukraine he did pay a heavy price. But in Syria, actually, there seems to be no real action by the West against Russia. In my opinion, on the contrary, some on the West decided that maybe Russia can be helpful actually in dealing with the Islamic State, and instead of taking most of the burden on our shoulder in order to face Daesh, the Russians might help us. So this is why the Americans, of course, I mean, the Americans were not really pleased by the Russian intervention in Syria, but on the other hand, they decided that we might be able to use it actually to our own advantage. So there are many reasons actually that, of course, I mean, people would like to think about Tartus, people would like to think about military bases in the Mediterranean. I would agree with that, but these reasons cannot explain actually the whole motivation that actually forced Putin to intervene in Syria at this particular stage. And of course, there is Turkey, there is the other regional players, there is the balance of power. There are so many issues actually, but it's not merely about Syria, it's about so many things.
And this confrontation between Putin and the West, does that explain the downing of the jet by the Turks? Because they could have easily let it go. It was only there for
I
a few
think there's a
seconds,
huge conflict.
crossing their airspace, and they clearly took a clear decision, determined to bring it down. No?
I think we have already mentioned that the war in Syria is a war by proxy now. Nobody is willing to lose Syria or to make the other side actually win Syria.
So a scoring point.
So for them, actually, there is a titanic conflict, in my opinion, not between the United States and Russia in Syria. In my opinion, there is no conflict per se between the United States and Russia in Syria, because the Americans are not really, they don't have a huge interest in this country. But for Turkey, it's completely different. There is a titanic conflict between Russia and Turkey in Syria. And the Turks, they did really want to draw certain lines for the Russians in Syria, because Syria is too important for Turkey to lose. I mean, from a geopolitical point of view, at least.
Right. Charles, if you allow me to come back to you, on the issue of the armed groups, the Jabhat al-Nusra is not included in the discussions tomorrow. But they have shown ability to negotiate with the release of the Lebanese soldiers. Do you think that was calculated in any way to try and distance themselves from IS and what it stands for, and try to lean maybe closer to the so-called middle ground or mainstream, or not?
I mean, yeah, yes, to some extent. I mean, I think Jabhat al-Nusra has always tried to distinguish itself from the Islamic State or from ISIL. Even when it was, strictly speaking, part of the Islamic State in Iraq, it was still trying to differentiate itself from its fatherly organization across the border. So yeah, there is an extent to which al-Nusra itself has sought to try and present itself as willing to talk pragmatically and strategically over issues like hostages. My personal opinion is that whilst many of al-Nusra's foot soldiers may well be young Syrians who have either been caught up in the wrong group or have chosen to join an organization that is quite simply one of the most powerful insurgent organizations in the country. Whilst that, I think, is true, the al-Nusra Front still, on a top level, represents al-Qaeda. And for that very reason, if you ever involved an organization like the al-Nusra Front in negotiations or in trying to form part of a negotiating team in Riyadh, there's just no way they'll ever play a productive role. And Syrians within the armed opposition would be the first people to tell you there is no point in inviting them to Riyadh, but they are still, or they may still be, our ally on the battlefield. So there really is no particular value in that. If I may, I would just wanted to go back to the Russia issue, if you don't mind. I think another important point is, I think it's long been underestimated the extent to which Russia had so much influence over Assad himself and over the regime's survival. Don't forget that after the chemical weapons attack outside Damascus in August 2013, that chemical weapons deal that was negotiated between the US and Russia was imposed on Assad by Putin. From what I'm aware, Putin essentially called him up and said, this is the deal, you're agreeing to it, end of discussion. And I think that the conventional wisdom has always been that it's Iran that has the real leverage over Assad, but in many respects I think Russia has been underestimated. It was also common wisdom on the ground in Syria that just prior to the Russian intervention, the Assad regime was in big trouble. And almost certainly Russia's intervention was to save Assad, not to bolster him, to save the regime from internal collapse because of the losses that they'd sustained over the months that preceded it. And this has had a really significant impact. But I think you also have to look at what are the effects of Russia's intervention. I mean, Russia intervened at the start, and it said explicitly this is a limited intervention. We are here only for a small period of time. I think they were talking about 3 months at the beginning, to fight terrorism. Now, clearly, fighting terrorism was not on its main list of priorities. I think we all understand that quite clearly. But we're pretty close to 3 months on, and what has Russia done? They've only escalated their intervention. We've seen them test firing a number of their most sophisticated, top-of-the-range cruise missiles, for example, which had never been used in combat before. Some of their most advanced fighter jets are on the ground. Their most advanced T-90 tanks have now been deployed south of Aleppo. Russia is in Syria now for the long haul. This is no longer a limited intervention. And part of the reason for that is that limited intervention at the start failed to have the effect that Putin wanted, which was to bolster Assad again, to save him and bolster him and secure a buffer zone along the coast. And that failed. And even now, the Russians are struggling to impose the kind of victories that they would have wanted. And I think another interesting readout that I had from several reliable sources is that when Assad surprised everyone by traveling to Moscow, one of the first things Putin essentially said to him was, what the hell is going on? What's wrong with you? Why is your army incapable of taking advantage of our air support? And from what I understand, the Russians were furious that the Syrian army had failed to such an extent. And this is why we've seen Putin steadily escalate the extent to which his military is intervening. And I think that is critically important in assessing the political process, in assessing the future, in assessing the potential role of jihadists in the long term, and also the political position of the armed opposition, which I think has become tougher since the Russian intervention than it was before. And without wanting to go on too long, the last thing I'll say is I think before Russia's intervention, what was fascinating was that the political and the armed opposition were coming close together. They had pretty much unified under one single sort of negotiating position and kind of a platform and an idea of what they wanted for Syria's future. And they were ready to negotiate. They would have probably sat opposite the table from the Iranians and from Bashar because they felt like they had some kind of advantage, but they were also unified. The danger is Russia's intervention, I think, has actually split, to some extent, that unity that had been created before. And it's caused an awful lot of chaos where the dust is still up in the air and no one quite knows when the dust is going to fall. And I think that's why Riyadh, the conference in Riyadh may have a harder time than perhaps it would have done if it had been held 3 months ago.
Absolutely.
Right. And Noah, you spent quite a bit of your time on the ground in northern Iraq, and you must be fully aware of the Iranian influence and growing influence in the region. Do you think without them being party to the conference in Riyadh, there is a chance that there will be a degree of success coming out of it? Or?
Well, excuse me, I think that certainly Iran has no role in a conference to determine who the opposition is, who represents the opposition. So I don't think it's a problem. I don't see it as a problem at all that Iran and Russia are not represented there, particularly Iran. They shouldn't be. I mean, they've got their own side in this.
But not even as observers, nothing.
Yeah, not even as observers. I think that unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic about the Vienna process's ultimate potential to resolve the conflict for the reasons I described earlier. The one thing I do have some optimism about is that at least it could be a cause, an incentive for the opposition and its state backers to sort out the opposition's internal equation, what my colleagues have already talked about with regard to the weight and representation of the main armed groups, how that's squared with the existing political opposition. If that happens, that would be a tremendous step forward because you need a credible opposition that's capable of negotiating for itself, implementing a deal, and protecting that deal from jihadi spoilers, if we ever get to that point. But that needs to happen within the opposition camp, and then that side would negotiate with Iran, Russia, and of course the regime itself. I do think that moving forward, I agree with Charles's assessment on the Russian role in particular. Since the Russian escalation, one major question moving forward will be, to what extent do Russia and Iran's interests start to diverge with regard to the major questions surrounding a political resolution. While the Russians are keen to maintain a somewhat ambiguous position on Assad's fate, I mean, they certainly are clear that they believe that should not be determined through this political, that should be left up to the Syrians, as they put it, which in practice means they believe he should stay indefinitely. The Iranians are much more clear in this regard, and I think the Iranians have a vision for Syria remaining in their resistance axis that they're very clear about, and don't seem at all willing to compromise on. The Russians, there's a potential difference in priorities and an ultimate long-term vision there between Iran and Russia. To what extent does that become important moving down? I think we'll only find out if a more meaningful political process starts to gain some momentum and the regime and its backers are put before some quite difficult choices.
Yeah, and how would that affect other minorities involved in the conflict? For example, the Kurds, the fact that half of them were included, the other half was excluded from the preparation as an opposition because they see them as, leaning more towards the regime and Iran. Those sort of voices, do you see them coming in the future as spoilers, or they just accept that they're not included and move on?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole 90 minutes simply on Syrian Kurdish politics and some of the military dynamics on the ground. Really, just to try and quickly summarize, I mean, within the Kurdish political scene, you have a real split between the Kandil PKK pole, of which the YPG, the Kurdish forces who control much of northeastern Syria, the YPG is effectively part of the PKK. The PYD, its political representation is a sort of junior component of that camp. And on the other side of the Kurdish spectrum, you have parties close to Erbil, to Barzani, and the Kurdistan regional government, particularly to Barzani himself. And obviously there's a big rift between the PKK and Barzani that goes way back before all of this, but has really manifested itself with regard to the Syrian Kurdish scene. The Barzani camp being closer, of course, to Turkey as well as to the Syrian opposition. I just spent a few days in YPG-controlled areas in northeastern Syria, and I think that really this is an interesting time for that movement. I think it's something of a crossroads with regard to their sort of international alliances. They see themselves as somewhat neutral in this conflict, opposing the regime, as they say it, but also opposing major elements of the opposition, including many of its Islamist groups, not just Nusra, but other groups with which it's currently clashing on and off north of Aleppo. They see themselves as a neutral party, yet also part of the opposition camp. They are both close to Iran and Russia in some ways, yet also have been the beneficiaries of very robust American military support as part of the coalition against ISIS. They have very difficult relations not only with the Barzani-linked Kurdish parties, but also with many non-Kurdish components of northeastern Syria, Arabs and Turkmen. And there seem to be different currents within that movement over the way forward. You have a more Kurdish nationalist strand that is really emphasizing the future of Kurdish dominance of that area and their own dominance in particular. You have another strand closer to the ideas of Öcalan, which have evolved over time, Öcalan being the head of the PKK, which are a bit more open to what they would define as pluralistic engagement with other elements of society, though in practice has been something quite less than pluralistic. And I don't necessarily get the sense that they have their next steps laid out. as effective as they have been on the ground. I think one key question moving forward in sort of the big strategic picture they face is to what extent the United States is prepared, willing and able to exert more of the leverage it presumably gains from the very robust military support that is providing to these forces against these YPG forces against ISIS. To what extent the US is ready, willing, and proactive in seeking to use that leverage to push the YPG from a position that is currently, in theory, neutral, but in practice leans a bit more towards the regime with which it shares control of Hasaka and Kamishli, toward a more truly neutral stance in which the armed conflict with components of the opposition would settle, and potentially there could be more cooperation with elements of the armed opposition, particularly with groups close to Turkey, against the shared goal of efforts against ISIS. I don't think we're there yet, but there's maybe potential for movement on this in the months ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me move the discussion now to the sort of the elephant in the room, ISIS. Because the cynics in our region would say that what's happening now in Riyadh and the whole movement towards the Vienna conference, etc., is really motivated by self-interest of Western countries to try and counter ISIS. And we observe two things. One is a shift in ISIS policy, it seems to me, that when they first came public, it was all about localism, it was all about building a khilafah, holding the land, governing the people, providing an alternative of governance, etc., etc. And they tried to distance themselves at the time from international terrorism and international operations and so on. And in the last few weeks, we saw a series of events, starting with Beirut, Paris, now there's the California thing. Yesterday, the assassination of the governor of Aden was all linked. What's going on there? I mean, that's one question. The other is that they seem to continuously attract allies in an alliance that is insisting on having no casualties and relying on air power. And if anything, it seems to just get stronger and more and stronger and influencing more and more people outside Syria. Marwan, could you start by giving us your assessment on
Yeah, sure. I think this revived interest in a political solution in Syria, I think, is mainly driven by the fear of ISIS.
Oh, you agree with that?
Absolutely, because it seems to me, as Syrians, I'm speaking as Syrians, the international community, the great powers actually were able to live with such a crisis in Syria, had it not been actually over the past, as we said, over the past year in particular, that Syria started actually to export two things to Europe and to the international community as a whole: refugees and terrorists. Mm-hmm. This actually, in my opinion, what made them think that maybe we need actually to establish a ground force in order to deal with ISIS, because the Americans, they have been bombing ISIS for the past 15 months, I think since September 2014, right after the fall of Mosul actually. Yes. They started to bomb, they established this international coalition to fight ISIS, which was to me, actually as a scholar of international relations, a bit bizarre to establish an international coalition to fight a non-state actor. I mean, to me, you bring all these countries to fight an entity that has
well-defined.
Exactly, well-defined, but not ISIS, which is, it doesn't really need that coalition. But anyway, there were other political motivations for the establishment of that international coalition. But anyway, they wanted to establish a ground force in order to fight, but they don't want to have boots on the ground. This is what President Obama said many times, actually. The Europeans, they don't want to do that. And everybody, as we said before, everybody seems to be willing to provide this air cover, but not having troops on the ground, or very limited involvement in this ground force. The Americans dispatched something like 50 special forces troops, to Syria, the last month. The Russians might have been actually more motivated to bring more troops, but I think they are also hesitant to get involved in this war landward. So this is why they are relying on the Syrian army, whereas the Americans are trying to rely on the Kurds. So they are trying to rely on local actors and provide them with this aerial cover. So indeed, I mean, Daesh was the main motives, in my opinion, that made everybody almost interested in reviving this process. And just a few days ago, it was this, when Kerry was talking about trying to bring both the Syrian opposition, the armed groups, and the Syrian army together in order to form a force that can deal with ISIS. So I would very much agree that ISIS was perhaps, I mean, the main factor that made them go actually this way.
Thank you so much. And Charles, has ISIS changed its strategic objective and its nature, what it stands for, or did we just misread it at the beginning?
I'll come to that in 1 minute. I just want to say, I think Marwan is absolutely right. I mean, I do think the West has. Vienna 2, the second meeting, was all about ISIL because it came the day after the Paris attacks.
Yeah.
So I think the threat of ISIS to the West, to the international community, in a broader sense, has intensified the commitment to the Vienna process. But I think Vienna 1 and the various preparatory meetings behind the scenes that took place before that were more spurred on by the refugee crisis and Russia's intervention. And I think those two things first brought the people to the table, the countries to the table, and ISIS has, in a sense, accelerated that process. Has ISIS changed? I mean, I think it's actually difficult to tell because I don't think we know yet enough about how the attacks in Paris, for example, were planned. It's easy enough to explain the downing of the jet over the Sinai as ISIS's affiliate in the Sinai took down a jet over Egypt. It's easy enough to say the assassination of the governor of Aden was done by ISIS affiliate in Yemen. But was the attack in Paris specifically centrally planned by ISIS in Raqqa or Mosul? You know, was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi playing the bin Laden role of you guys, you and you and you will go to Belgium and then Paris and carry out attacks against restaurants? I don't think we know that yet, not publicly anyway. And for that reason, I would still say no, ISIS hasn't changed at all. ISIS has always been an inherently localist force. Its focus has always been to establish territorial control, to destabilize on that periphery and continue to expand their territorial control, and thereby claim, at least, that they have a state and then one day a khalifa. And I don't think foreign attacks change that. You know, we've known for a long time that ISIS's chief spokesman has been railing against the international community for its airstrikes against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And not only has he been railing against those airstrikes, but he has explicitly said and called upon their supporters around the world, who for one reason or another either aren't willing to travel to the caliphate or have taken up this call, to carry out attacks on their behalf. So in a sense, they've taken on the Al-Qaeda idea of inspiring foreigners to act on their behalf. And the spokesman, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, went as far, I mean, I can't remember the exact quote, but he went as far as to say, you know, if you can purchase weapons and carry out an attack, if you can't, get in your car and drive someone over, and if you even can't do that, spit in his face. And this is literally what he said. And this is what we're seeing now carrying out in the West, is exactly this, people answering that call. And with regards to the Paris attack specifically, I don't think the involvement of a former ISIS militant who had been in Syria necessarily changes that calculation. It could do. It could be that the intelligence agencies in France and elsewhere know more than I do. But I think as of now, we can't draw the conclusion that ISIS has established a centralized foreign attack strategy yet.
Right. So Noah, a very big question, and you don't have to answer it. Do you ever see ISIS sitting around the table then? The Islamic State being part of a political settlement in the region?
No. Would be my short answer to that.
End of answer.
End of answer. No, I don't. And I'll leave that at that. I think everything about their ideology and their strategy, their tactics says that's simply not realistic. I mean, certainly de facto control in which fronts are de-escalated, one can imagine, but sitting at a table negotiating, no. That would be, for them, that would be to acknowledge the legitimacy, if only implicitly, of everything which they reject in terms of the world order. Just one more bit on Western strategy with regard to ISIS. I think what has been so frustrating for probably many of us in this room, most of us covering this conflict, has been some of the disconnects in the Western approach to the Daesh problem. And to focus on the most important Western player, in this case the United States, you have, in theory, and even in their rhetoric, the US officials recognize that ultimately significantly degrading this organization is going to require credible local ground forces, and that those forces in Sunni Arab areas are going to need to be Sunni Arab forces, hopefully, ideally from that area. And that in Syria, that means major rebel groups, and smaller ones as well. It means rebel groups in much of Syria. They recognize this intellectually, the Americans do. But in practice, their strategy is to do what is politically viable against ISIS, airstrikes, holding international conferences such as Vienna, things that come at very low political cost in terms of the American domestic debate, but actually accomplishing the major political and military progress that would be necessary to that is necessary for rebel groups in Syria to dedicate more resources toward ISIS. This is something the Americans have not invested in. I mean, just simply logistically speaking, rebels, given the regime, Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah offensive against them on multiple fronts, do not have sufficient manpower resources to dedicate towards significantly degrading ISIS. There's also the issue of the fact that the regime and its allies kill by a huge margin, by several times over. The regime and its allies kill many more Syrians, militants, and most importantly, civilians, than does ISIS. So of course they're not going to, they're going to focus on they're going to prioritize what is the clear and present danger. The Americans recognize this, but they don't have a political strategy, let alone a military one, to accomplish the progress towards a meaningful political transition in Syria that would ultimately end Assad rule and would enable gradually some of these rebel groups that the United States needs as partners against ISIS to dedicate more resources towards that actual fight. And there's not a strategy for that. There's no prospect of a strategy for that, either on the part of the United States or any other Western country.
Right. Well, with that optimistic, not very optimistic note, if I may, we still have 2 minutes before I open the discussion to our audience. The issue of refugees, we refer to it as one of the motivations that got at least Europe on board at the moment. Yesterday in Istanbul, I heard a very surprising fact that they're saying only 40% of the refugees arriving are actually Syrians. But the cause of Syria is being more or less hijacked by refugees from everywhere else who are coming to Europe. And in a way, those I was talking to were lamenting the fact that the failed Arab states in the past provided Europe with a buffer zone that stopped many people for a long time, like from Afghanistan, Africa, as other, who has been wanting to come to Europe for a long time. And now things have changed. Do you see that getting Europe to focus on the longer term, or would they continue to be opportunistic and just try and fix the immediate crack in the region at the moment? Are they going to focus on the bigger picture?
If you allow me, to say just something that I feel must be said about this refugees crisis. I have the feeling that, the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, was using his own people in order to punish his neighbors and the Europeans. For me, it was a deliberate policy to displace as many Syrians as possible and export them outside the country and make other nations, Turkey, Jordan, other nations, Europe, of course, pay the price, actually, or part of the price
It's
of
a
the
war
Syrian
strategy.
crisis. Exactly, it was a war strategy for him. And I think to a certain extent he did succeed, because today everybody is thinking about having the sort of political solution that doesn't necessarily actually lead to the departure of Bashar al-Assad. I mean, today nobody is really, I mean, in the West, I'm talking about the change in the French position, for example, towards Bashar al-Assad, the shift in the US position. Today in the United States, nobody is talking about Bashar al-Assad should leave, actually, or should depart. Everybody is talking about, we'll talk about this later, yeah? So let's start something in order to stop this this crisis. So I think to a certain extent, yes, he did use his own people in order to punish others and to bring them actually to talk to him once again. And he succeeded to an extent. As far as Europe is concerned, I feel like the Europeans, it's not only now, or it's not only about the Syrian crisis, but this has always been the policy of the European Union, or the European states actually, of having a very short-sighted policy concerning not only the refugee crisis, but concerning their neighborhood. I'm talking about North Africa, the Middle East. There has always been the potential that as long as there are problems, there are underdevelopment, there are tyranny in these countries, there are so many problems that is leading actually to migration and refugees that are actually invading Europe. But the Europeans have not been really very successful in dealing with the roots of the problems, the causes of these problems, which are leading these people actually to leave their countries and go to Europe. So this has been very short, as I said, a very short-sighted policy. And the Syrian crisis, I don't know if it made things really different for the Europeans, because now they have this agreement with Turkey in order to prevent...
They created the buffer.
Exactly. And that is not going to be a solution. It might be a long-term viable solution, I mean, to the crisis of refugees. Maybe they should think about stopping the reasons that are leading these people to leave their countries in the first place before thinking about the consequences.
Yeah. Great. Charles, would you like to add anything?
I might just, I think yes, the displacement of people and preferably making them refugees was absolutely a centralized government policy. I mean, you need only read back over some of Assad's statements himself, where he talked about cleansing his country. That can mean only one thing: push the guys out that don't like me, and only the good ones will remain. And whether or not that was also, by extension, a policy of making your neighbors suffer or not, I couldn't say, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. It also has significant implications. If you want to sort of give Assad the cynical credit, it also has implications in terms of how a political solution looks, and how viable a political solution with Assad being transitioned out looks. At the moment, it's far from surprising that because of things like the refugee crisis and the displacement of opposition people from Syria, it's no surprise that people in Western countries now are talking about the possibility of partitioning Syria. You know, maybe this is an easy fix, because there are more clearly aligned areas of the country which are pro and anti the regime. And then, of course, the ISIL territory in other parts of the country. And again, if you want to give Assad, as I say, the sort of cynical credit, maybe that was intended as well. There were negotiations a few months ago between Iran and Ahrar Sham over the fate of one town outside Damascus called Zabadani near the Lebanese border, which was besieged by the regime, and two Shia towns in the north of the country, which were besieged by the opposition. It's no surprise that Iran's position in the negotiating table there was essentially a sectarian population swap. We will shift the predominantly Sunni oppositionists from Zabadani and we'll put them in the north of the country. And we'll shift the Shia, who are in these two isolated villages in the north, and we'll move them down to the south to regime territory. So this has been a quite purposeful strategy on the regime side, probably with very long-term objectives in mind, with exactly this, the idea that at the worst case scenario, the regime knows that it's got its people in the right place, and that one day the international community might feel enough pain that they accept this kind of idea as a worst case scenario. And this is a worry when at the same time we see Western policy being so reactive, and there is no long-term strategy in the West, whether it's for countering ISIL or dealing with Assad. Vienna was a reaction to the Russian intervention. And Riyadh was a reaction to the fact that Vienna seemed to be going all right, but the armed opposition complained viciously that they weren't involved. And so long as Western strategy is reactive, there will be no solution to the refugee crisis. In fact, next year will be far worse than this year. And the winter already looks like it may be a harsh one in Syria, and the conditions locally are far worse than they were last year in terms of the access to oil and gas and other foodstuffs. And when you have Russian airstrikes bombing bakeries in a quite targeted fashion across northern Syria, people are going to be without food as well. So long as we don't have a more credible strategy with real depth to it, we, quote unquote, in the West are going to continue to suffer consequences. No more as Syrians, of course, but that will continue to be the case.
So I think if I may just add one thing that is really, in my opinion, indicative, to the strategy of the regime. The regime was really furious when the Vienna Declaration stated that all Syrians inside and outside the country should actually take part in any presidential elections or any parliamentary elections in the future. And the regime was absolutely mad about this because they just wanted Syrians who are inside the country and because most of the Syrians actually live under control of the regime in the regime-dominated areas. So that's what the regime actually wanted, these people actually to take part in any election in the future. And this explains also or add to what we have already mentioned, that it was a deliberate policy of displacing as many people who are opposing the regime as possible, just ejecting them out of the country.
And just one thing I'll add to all those great points is one particularly distressing thing about the Russian approach, especially for those of us who have been hopeful throughout the conflict for a more positive Russian role, is that what Russia has effectively done in its military intervention is embrace the existing regime military strategy that you both outlined quite eloquently, including with regard to displacement and the regime's use of collective punishment, in particular aerial bombardment. That it's not really indiscriminate because it's discriminately targeting civilian areas. The regime has continued to do that since Russia has become more involved, and the Russians to some extent have been doing it as well, despite the fact that when you meet with Iranian and as well as Russian officials, they will always tell you that they're against the barrel bombing, they don't like this and this. But at no point have they pressured the regime to end those tactics. Even now, when clearly the direct leverage they could use to do so is there, and indeed, and to some extent, are engaging in these tactics themselves. So I hate to have all my answers be pessimistic, but given how our only hope for ending this conflict at the moment is the Russians sort of bringing the regime around, this is just another reason to be pessimistic about that at this stage.
Great. Well, thank you, the three of you. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'd like now to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you could please, if you have a question, if you can introduce yourself, and what we'll do, because we've only left with about 20 minutes, I'll take 2 or 3 rounds of questions and ask our speakers to respond.
Hi,
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Aishwarya from Qatar Today. I want to ask Mr. Lister about what he said about the partition of Syria. My sense is that we haven't been hearing a lot about it. Is it because it's Plan B? If yes, then what will it take to make it Plan A?
Okay. Another question? Please. And then the gentleman behind you immediately after.
Okay. My name is Raj Abdel Fattah, a Syrian from the north part. Why Bayada or YPG not a part of opposition? And why they don't invite them to Riyadh?
Why not invite?
Why the BUD, has
UAD.
been invited to Riyadh?
سعيد سوري نقلت الأخبار بأنه تم توجيه الدعوة لجيش الفتح للمشاركة في الرياض. وجيش الفتح معروف من مكوناته الرئيسية هي النصرة. يعني بإدلب مثلا كان بشكل 80% من جيش الفتح النصرة. طيب هلا الأخوان الثلاثة المتحدثين عم يصروا أن النصرة ما له وجود في الرياض. إذا ممكن بس شو
ما له وجود في المفاوضات.
مع وجود جيش الفتح بالمفاوضات بقسمين، جيش فتح الغاب وجيش فتح الجنوب.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's try and answer those three, and then I'll come back for a second round of questions. Plan A, Plan B, Charles?
Sure. What will it take? I mean, as I say, partition is Plan B because it is the last resort. So what would it take to make us seek the last resort solution? A dramatic expansion of ISIL power, sort of catastrophic Russian escalation, the collapse of the Vienna peace talks.
Expansion of ISIL outside, you mean?
Inside Syria, so the further expansion of ISIL inside Syria into opposition and regime territory. I mean, essentially the answer to your question is, well, what are the other worst case scenarios within today's conditions? If Vienna collapses and there's no resolution, I have no doubt that more Western politicians will start to talk about partition being a possible way out. I'm sure they will. Unfortunately, more often than not, Western politicians seek the easy way out. We're now seeing more and more people starting to say that Assad is a more viable solution to ISIL. Of course, there aren't only two options in Syria, but we are seeing more and more Western politicians suggesting that. So it would seem to, my suggestion would be that that same kind of trend would carry on. If you don't mind me just answering the Jaish al-Fatah point,
We'll go to ask Noah.
Okay, that's fine.
It's okay. Marwan, why was the PAD excluded from Riyadh? We kind of touched upon it when we talked earlier about the Kurds.
Yeah, well, I think because the PAD is mainly considered as, I mean, most of the opposition groups actually, they objected to that the PAD is invited to the conference because they believe that this is an ally of the regime and this is not an opposition in the first place. I mean, to be invited to Riyadh. It's associated with the regime, with the Russians, with the Iranians. So it's with the other camp. So they must come actually with the other delegation, not with the opposition delegation. So that was, in my opinion, why actually the PAD was not invited.
Thank you. And Noah, Jaish al-Fatah and the Nusra is one and the same.
Right, so Jaish al-Fatah, of course, is a coalition that includes Jabhat al-Nusra as well as Ahrar al-Sham, Falik al-Sham, and some others. There was no invitation given to Jaish al-Fatah as a unit, right? The invitations were given to individuals within some of the groups that are participating in Jaish al-Fatah, in particular Ahrar al-Sham, most notably Ahrar al-Sham and Falik al-Sham. So a representative from Ahrar al-Sham and a representative from Falik al-Sham will be participating in Riyadh as representatives of Ahrar al-Sham and Falik al-Sham, not of Jaish al-Fatah as a broader alliance. So Jabhat al-Nusra will not have a direct presence at Riyadh. And again, this gets back to the key ideological, strategic, and political differences between Jabhat al-Nusra on one hand and other elements of Jaish al-Fatah on the other. And the tactical, for tactical reasons, that cooperation continues. For political, and ideological, and strategic reasons, it doesn't carry over into the political realm, including Riyadh. And I'll just add half a note on the PYD as well. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the PYD is allied with the regime or the YPG, though they certainly do coordinate on certain things. I would note, however, that when Daesh attacked Hasaka over the last couple of months, they attacked regime areas. And the PYD notably did not come to their defense, or not the PYD, the YPG, the military wing, did not come to the regime's defense really until Daesh forces approached areas that were under YPG control and have a Kurdish population. And really this may have been, to some extent, it's hard to tell if this was American pushing or the YPG's own decision, but what happened is that as the YPG beat back Daesh and took back these areas, most of which were regime-held originally. I was just in Hasaka a few days ago. The YPG now controls most of those areas that were controlled by the regime. They gave a bit back, but they now control most of those areas. Now, there are still coordinated checkpoints. There's one checkpoint where you have YPG guys here and regime guys here, and they're clearly getting along fine. Yeah. But it's something less than a complete alliance. I would say they lean towards the regime rather than towards the opposition. I think it's appropriate that they are not major participants in Riyadh because of that lean, but that's not to say they may not switch that lean over time.
Yeah, but this is how the opposition.
I agree completely.
And it's also more. It's less to do, in my opinion, at least, with the relationship or not with the regime. It's more about what does the PYD actually want in Syria. Do the PYD's objectives in Syria match those of the opposition? And they don't. All of them.
In what way?
Well, the PYD has taken somewhat of an ambiguous line, but it's quite clear that they are structurally linked to the PKK. I mean, there's bountiful evidence of that. And it's quite clear that the PKK does not want to be part of a pluralist system in all of Syria. PYD wants some extent of autonomy. They may not necessarily want to split. But autonomy is an absolute red line for all of the opposition. Even the Assad acceptable opposition in Damascus won't even consider the idea of Kurdish autonomy. So just for the very fact that the PYD and the opposition contradict so inherently about what they want for Syria means that it would just make no sense for the PYD to be part of an opposition conference. And probably even more importantly, probably 80% of people in Riyadh would refuse to take part in a conference that had the PYD as part of it. They literally would walk out the room.
Thank you, Charles. We'll take a second round of questions, please.
تحسين الفقير موظف سابق في وزارة الخارجية السورية. بعتقد قبل ما يبلشوا بالأسئلة ختام الجمل اللي حكوا فيها كانت هي تشفي صدور الشعب السوري كما معاناته. السؤال اللي بدي أسأله أنه الأدمغة والعقول السياسية في العالم حتى الآن لم تصل إلى تعريف والتمييز ما بين الإرهاب والنضال الثوري. هذا سؤال لحد هلا يعني ليست الدول هي من تحدد الإرهاب وتحدد النضال الثوري. دعوا الشعوب تقرر. بعدين أمام البطش الروسي بقتل السوريين والتدمير اللي عم يصير وقتل كل من يناوئ النظام.
And in view of the fact that these differences exist, do you think Vienna or Riyadh will make the Syrian government group will accept the opposition demands? Muhammad Samman.
I was looking at the names of those who were invited to attend the Riyadh conference, or I think it's Abha conference right now. And to me, based on long observation for a long time and extensive researches, 30% of those who are invited to attend this conference in Saudi Arabia are straightforward Muslim Brotherhood, aka Ikhwan. And another, in my estimation, 30% are actually influenced by Ikhwan. So I would really like to listen to the gentlemen here, their opinion about the outcomes of such conference and with such representation and influence. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, please, right in the corner.
My name is Muhammad. I'm Syrian. I have a comment on what Mr. Marwan said, that Syria is exporting the refugees and terrorists. Actually, the terror is not an individual activity in the world. It's a regular activity, and it's supposed to be supervised by an organizations. So this is the first point. The Syrian people, they are civils, and the civilians are not involved in this war of terror between the Western and the Islamic State. This is the comment. Thank you.
Thank you. With that being a comment, I'll take a question, so please.
Mohammed Sergi, Bloomberg News, but not as a Bloomberg News question. A couple of years ago, Belfer Center at Harvard had a study of how civil wars end. And they looked at wars from 1940 to 2007. And basically, there are three outcomes: opposition, a rebel victory, regime victory, or a negotiated settlement. And the study showed that the most stable outcome was a rebel victory, second most stable, regime, and worst outcome is a negotiated settlement. Yet everything that we're doing now is going for the worst outcome. And even if we're optimistic about Vienna, optimistic about Riyadh, 2-3 years down the road, even if we have a transition of this negotiated settlement, we're still going to be facing a lot of the same problems. And I'd like to hear your views on that.
Great, thank you. I'll start with you, maybe Marwan, on the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you. I'm not sure about...
No, don't answer that question.
Okay.
I'm asking you a different question. I'm directing to you the question on the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That 30% seem to be Muslim Brotherhood. Does that represent a change of heart in Saudi Arabia itself, that they've softened their position towards the Muslim Brotherhood and with King Salman coming to power now, or is just a coincidence?
Well, first of all, I'm not really sure about how correct that is, that 30% are Ikhwan and 30% are influenced by Ikhwan. So this means actually this is an Ikhwan gathering. I'm not really sure about that. But anyway, I mean, answering your question, yes, I think the Saudis are less obsessed about the threat of the Ikhwan under King Salman than they used to be under the late King Abdullah. Because at that time, Saudi foreign policy was very awkward for so many people in the sense that they were creating so many enemies to deal with. On the one hand, they have the Shiite crescent actually dealing with Iran, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, Al-Maliki government, all together, and on the other hand, they are having their enemies on the Sunni side also, the Ikhwan who are actually ruling in Egypt, Al-Islah in Yemen, and you know they have even their problems with Qatar, and so there were so many enemies. So at that time, most of us actually were thinking, what the hell is this? Is this a rational foreign policy, creating so many enemies around you from both the Sunni and fighting both the Shiite and the Sunni? I think under King Salman, he started to recognize actually that he might be actually focusing maybe more on the strategic threat for the Saudi kingdom, which is in this case Iran. This is why he decided to go in Yemen and try to stop the Houthis from controlling Yemen, because that could have been a major blow, in my opinion, to the Saudi Arabia national security. This is why also how he decided actually to get perhaps more involved in supporting the Syrian opposition in the north. So he was actually like besieged by Iran from north and from south altogether. So he decided to actually to reconsider his position about the Ikhwan in Yemen, inside Saudi Arabia itself, because as you know, under King Abdullah, the Ikhwan were labeled by the Saudi government as terrorist organization. So I think, yes, now, don't forget also that they started to improve their relationship with Turkey, and Turkey was seen under King Abdullah as also a major competitor. I won't describe Turkey as an enemy or a rival, but as a major competitor. It was seen by the Saudi elite at that time as a threat, because it was somehow sponsoring the Ikhwan expansion in the region, and that was considered as a threat. I think the Saudi position has changed a lot concerning the Ikhwan under King Salman.
Great, thank you so much. And Noah, the issue of definitions and the mix-up between terrorism and resistance and opposition parties and so on.
Yeah, certainly this has become a major part of it's become a part of the Vienna discussion. Russia would like this to become a major part of the Vienna discussion, defining who terrorist groups are. What we see with the Russians, right? They came in emphasizing that they began their intervention emphasizing that they'd be fighting ISIS. And then ISIS and terrorism in general, they hit whoever they want. Anti-ISIS groups in northwestern Syria, sometimes they'll call them ISIS, sometimes they'll just say they were terrorists. In both cases, from most of our perspectives, that would be incorrect. Certainly, it's factually incorrect to say they're ISIS. And the Russians are quite clear that a group like Jaish al-Islam or Ahrar al-Sham, Islamist armed groups, they certainly view as terrorists. They sometimes, and some officials will sometimes even define all armed groups, everyone taking up arms against the Syrian state, as a terrorist, though they've had some flexibility rhetorically on that. There's obviously a clear difference between that definition and the way the opposition, its backers, even its Western backers, define that. And I think what we have seen among Western countries is a couple of years ago, there was discussion in Washington, for instance, about putting Ahrar al-Sham on the terrorism list. Now, that never happened, and I'm glad it did not. That would have been a mistake in my view. Now, instead of talking about putting Ahrar al-Sham on the terrorism list, there's serious discussion about engaging them politically and some movement in that direction. So I think that is indicative, one, of the evolution of a group like Ahrar, which I mentioned earlier, also an evolution, and I would say a maturation in the thinking of American officials, who frankly didn't really have a good grasp, I would say analytically, of the Syrian Islamist scene to begin with, and have gradually improved over time. The Russians want to make defining who a terrorist is a big issue at Vienna. They want certain groups, including the two I just mentioned, Ahrar and Jaish al-Islam, put on that list. I don't think that's going to go anywhere because nobody on the opposition side, including the US and Western states, is going to accept that. I expect you'll see a sort of stalling on that issue. Now this issue's been handed to Jordan to sort of head an effort to define what a terrorist is in Syria. I wouldn't expect that to go anywhere because the Russians can't impose it on everyone else.
Thank you so much. And Charles, you've been working with the Brookings on track 2 for almost 2 years now. And now we hear that negotiated settlement is probably the worst option you should have gone for. What's your view on this academic study that showed that most conflicts have ended either by full victory, one side or the other?
I remember reading it years ago at university. I think it's probably right. Whilst you can always debate statistical studies, I think it theoretically does make sense. The fact remains that, as I think has been repeatedly said on the panel so far, there is a easy-to-make recognition now that neither the opposition nor the regime have the power to win or not enough power to lose. No one is going to militarily win this conflict, barring some huge apocalyptic event. There is no military victory. So the only solution is a political one, and that means a negotiated solution. So I don't really think the international community has much choice. I mean, unless the US is going to start sending in a mass of ground troops to cooperate with the opposition, which is never going to happen. And unless Russia escalates to such an extent that it would then force the West to intervene again in a very significant extent, that's not going to happen either. So I think there's been for quite some time, a recognition that the only way out is a negotiated solution. The opposition recognizes that. Whether or not the regime does, I don't know. As much as it resists that reality, deep down it probably does know it's going to have to come to the table at some point, and certainly its backers know that. So whilst that study specifically might suggest that negotiated solutions have the worst durable outcomes, we don't have much of a choice. The only other thing I would say is if the best result is an opposition victory, I hate making parallels, but look at Libya. I mean, an opposition victory in Libya hasn't worked out particularly well either.
And it's ultimately about the price the Syrian people are having to pay. I mean, you can't maybe allow it to go either way at this stage. I must bring it to a conclusion, and please join me in...
One last point, because I think I was misunderstood here or misquoted. I wouldn't describe Syrians, of course, as terrorists, because I was saying that Europeans, they would think that two things that they wouldn't actually... I said they decided to go for a political solution when they started to be hit by terrorism and by refugees. But I didn't say that. I wouldn't, describe my own people as terrorists.
I left that question out because I think you still have the chance to clarify it directly with Marwan over a bite and a drink. And I would like to ask you all to join me in showing our appreciation for our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much. Please join us for something to eat, and to also as an opportunity to get to know our speakers better. And if you have any question that you did not get the opportunity to ask, please feel free to approach them directly. Thank you.